I've always liked camping, especially in quieter areas where the noise of the city can't reach me. Over the years, I've built a kind of personal routine. I hike during the day, set up camp before the sun drops, and I keep things as minimal and quiet as possible once the dark sets in. There's a calm that comes with being away from people, but at the same time, the woods at night can turn that calm into something sharp and uneasy. I know that. I respect it. One thing I've also learned is that you don't mess with other people's camps. It's a kind of unspoken rule out there. You don't cut through, you don't wander around their tents, and you don't give anyone reason to think you're up to something. When I cross paths with other campers, I keep it quick and polite. If I have to pass through close by in the dark, I make myself known in a normal way if they're awake. If they're asleep, I move quietly and keep my distance. I would never walk through someone's sight. That feels like crossing a line I don't ever want to cross. There was one trip, though, where that unspoken rule weighed heavier on me than ever before. It was in early fall, when the days were cool but not yet freezing, and the nights had a kind of damp chill that seeped into your clothes if you weren't prepared. I had picked a forested area in the northern part of the state, not far from a mountain ridge I'd been meaning to hike for a while. The trails were less maintained there, which was part of the draw. I wanted the sense of being away from everything, of earning the miles and the silence. The first day went smoothly. I parked at the small dirt lot near the trailhead, strapped my pack on, and set off. The trail wound through dense woods, the kind where the canopy blocks out most of the sunlight and everything beneath it looks darker than it really is. I moved at a steady pace, stopping only to sip water and check my bearings. The air was cool, and the forest smelled of pine, damp earth, and fallen leaves breaking down into soil. By late afternoon, I'd gone further than I first planned. I wanted a quiet, flat spot to set up my tent, and I hadn't found one I liked yet. Around that time, I started to notice I wasn't as alone as I thought. Through the trees, far ahead, I saw a thin column of smoke. It blended with the branches and the dimming light, but it was there. I kept hiking, figuring someone had set up camp nearby. Sure enough, as the trail curved and then straightened, I caught sight of a clearing off to the right. A tent was pitched close to the tree line, with a small fire burning low in a ring of stones. I could see a couple of backpacks leaned against a log. Nobody was moving around, though. I slowed, careful not to make too much noise. I didn't want to disturb anyone. I kept to the left side of the trail, avoiding the clearing. I didn't linger. I passed by quietly, keeping my eyes ahead. Out of respect, I didn't look too long at their setup. Just a quick glance, then back to the trail. I didn't hear anyone. No voices, no footsteps, just the faint crackle of the fire. It crossed my mind that maybe they had gone into their tent early, or maybe they were out gathering wood. I moved on, eventually finding a spot of my own about half a mile further down the trail. It was small but flat, with enough space to fit my tent and a little area for cooking. I got my gear set up, boiled water for a meal, and ate while the last light drained out of the sky. The forest around me grew darker by the minute. By the time I was finishing, the fire I'd seen earlier was out of sight. That night was quiet, but not in a relaxing way. Every shift of the wind through the trees felt sharp. Every cracking branch in the distance felt closer than it really was. I told myself it was just the normal night sounds, and I went to sleep, though my rest was shallow. The next morning, I hiked further up toward the ridge, carrying only a day pack. I left my main gear at camp, tucked away and secure. The hike was tough but rewarding. From the ridge, I could see valleys spread out below me, layers of trees in every direction. The air was clear, crisp, with the faint smell of wood smoke drifting up. That reminded me of the campers I'd passed the day before. On the way back down toward my own camp, I noticed something strange. As I walked the trail, I saw faint footprints in the dirt. They weren't fresh, but they were recent, maybe from that morning or the night before. I kept moving, but as I got closer to where I'd seen the other camp, I noticed more prints. They weren't just crossing the trail. They circled back, more than once, as though someone had paced or doubled over their own tracks. It looked messy, confused. I slowed down. The prints went toward the clearing I'd seen, then looped back out. In one spot, The dirt was churned up, like someone had stood there too long. My stomach tightened a little. I kept walking, eyes ahead, until the clearing came into view. Only now there was no tent. The fire pit was cold, scattered. The log where the backpacks had been was empty. The place looked abandoned, like they had picked up and left fast. But the prints remained, some leading in, some out, circling, like whoever had been there wasn't moving in a straight line. It felt off. I passed quickly, again staying quiet, but my mind was racing. Why would they circle like that? Why not just pack up and leave in one clear direction? The sight of those overlapping tracks unsettled me more than if I'd found the camp still occupied. Back at my own site, I tried to shake it off. I ate, rested, and prepared for another night. But the feeling stayed with me. When darkness came, I lay in my tent, listening harder than usual. The woods seemed too still. I kept imagining footsteps circling outside, overlapping, never leaving. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard movement. Not close, but not far either. A branch snapped, then another. I froze, heart hammering. The sounds weren't heavy like an animal. They were spaced out, slow, deliberate. Felt like someone was walking, pausing, walking again. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The steps faded after a while, but I couldn't shake the thought that they might return. Sleep never really came back to me after that. I lay there, wide-eyed, waiting for dawn. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed quickly, faster than I normally would, and started back toward the trailhead. On the way, I passed the clearing again. The ground looked worse in daylight. The circles of prints were clearer, looping in and out, always returning to the same direction they'd come from, as though someone had been walking around in the dark, not leaving, not arriving, just circling. It made my skin crawl. I didn't stop moving. I just kept going, faster than before, not slowing until I reached my car. By the time I was on the road again, I still didn't know what had happened there, or why the tracks looked that way. All I knew was that it was nothing I ever wanted to stumble across again. I've been camping many times since then, but that trip stuck with me. I'll never forget the sight of those tracks circling and circling, never going anywhere, as if someone had been out there in the night, pacing the edge of camps, waiting. It reminded me why I keep my distance from others when I camp, and why I always move quietly if I have to pass by. Some things in the woods don't need to be explained to still be frightening. And out there, it doesn't take much to turn normal rules into survival. I still think about that night sometimes. It was a few years ago, back when my ex and I were still together. We had decided to go camping with one of her friends, a guy she worked with at the time. The three of us weren't especially close, but we all shared a love of the outdoors, and it felt like a good excuse to get away from the noise of town for a weekend. We picked a spot not far from a lake, the kind of campground where you had to hike in a short distance to reach the sites. It was summer, warm enough to sleep with the tent flaps open, the air buzzing with insects and the smell of pine. We set up camp, unpacked our coolers, and built a fire before the sun dipped too low behind the trees. By nightfall, we were sitting around the fire, passing beers, poking at the flames, and letting the night settle in. There's a certain silence in the woods that you don't really notice until you're away from the constant hum of cars and electricity. It's thick, heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional bird or snap of a branch. I was leaning back in my camp chair when it happened. The guy just walked out of the trees. He didn't come up from the trail or wander in from a nearby site. He came from the dark brush, from a direction that didn't make sense, like he'd been watching us. No flashlight, no gear in his hands, just himself. He didn't say a word, didn't nod, didn't smile. He just walked straight over and sat down on one of the logs near the fire, close enough that I could smell him, sweat, dirt, maybe even a faint hint of alcohol. I remember the three of us looking at each other. My ex raised her eyebrows, her friend stared at the fire, and I felt my stomach drop. Silence stretched out. It felt like it lasted forever, but in reality, it couldn't have been more than 30 or 40 seconds. The fire popped, sending sparks up into the air. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then he started talking. Not about us, not about what he was doing there. He just launched into this rambling monologue about his day. How he'd hiked along some ridge. How he'd found a good fishing spot but didn't bring his pole. How he liked the smell of the woods at night. Just random small talk. As if he hadn't just walked out of nowhere and sat down uninvited at a stranger's fire. I remember gripping my beer can so tightly it dented. My ex shifted in her seat, and her friend tried to smile politely, but no one said anything. We didn't respond, not at first. He just talked, filling the silence with this strange, uneven voice. Eventually, the guy's words blurred together, and I caught myself studying him more than listening. He looked normal enough, maybe mid-30s, with a short beard and messy hair under a cap. His clothes were typical cargo pants, a faded t-shirt, hiking boots. He wasn't some wild-eyed drifter, but there was something about his presence that felt off, like he didn't quite belong in his own skin. He never introduced himself, never asked if he could sit down. After a while, I forced myself to speak, just enough to acknowledge him, hoping maybe he'd take the hint and leave. But he didn't. He kept sitting there, drinking from a bottle he pulled from his pocket, talking about trails and weather and random things that didn't matter. The fire burned lower as the hours slipped by. The night got darker and colder, and still he didn't move. He didn't glance toward the tents or mention where he was camped. For all we knew, he had nowhere to go. That unease grew heavier with every passing minute. I kept waiting for him to stand up and say goodbye, but he didn't. My ex and her friend got quieter, and I could feel all three of us retreating into ourselves, each too nervous to make the first move. When the fire dropped to glowing coals, the woods pressed in around us. I wanted to get up and stoke it, just for the comfort of light, but I didn't want to turn my back on the stranger. Something about him made me feel like I couldn't let him out of my sight. Finally, my ex's friend stood up and stretched, mumbling something about getting more wood. He walked toward the tree lean, and for the first time, the stranger's eyes followed him. He didn't say anything, didn't move, but the way his head tracked the guy sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood and said something about calling it a night, my voice shaking more than I'd have liked. My ex followed my lead, and we slipped into our tent. The last thing I saw before zipping the flap shut was the man still sitting there, staring into the embers. Inside the tent, the air was stifling. None of us spoke. We just lay there, stiff as boards, listening. Every rustle outside made my chest tighten. I kept waiting for footsteps, for the sound of someone circling the tent. But all I heard was the occasional crack of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. I must have dozed off at some point, though it was a restless kind of half-sleep. When I woke, it was still dark, but the fire had gone out. I lay there for a moment, trying to listen past the pounding in my ears. That's when I realized the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a faint sound, steady and close, breathing, slow, even breathing just outside the tent. I froze. My eyes strained against the darkness, but I didn't dare move. My ex shifted beside me, but I pressed my hand against her arm, silently begging her not to make a sound. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Then, as quietly as it started, it faded. I heard soft footsteps retreat into the woods, twigs snapping under weight, then nothing. We didn't sleep after that. At first light, we packed up everything in silence. I scanned the campsite for any sign of him, but there was nothing. No gear, no footprints I could make out, no trace that he had ever been there at all. We hiked out without speaking, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I never saw him again. Looking back, I don't know what he wanted. Maybe he was just lonely, maybe drunk, maybe harmless. But the way he came out of the dark without a word, the way he lingered, the way he stood outside our tent in the middle of the night, I can't shake the feeling that we got lucky. That he could have done something, and for reasons I'll never know, he chose not to. Even now, years later, I can still hear that breathing outside the tent. Steady, patient, too close. I think I have the creepiest camping story, and the strangest part is that it doesn't even feel like it belongs to me. It feels like something that slipped past me by inches, something I was never supposed to be close to, but somehow was. For years, my family had a stationary caravan at a small campground near the North Sea. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest setup, the kind of place where families came year after year. There were maybe 40 or 50 caravans there permanently, lined up in rows, familiar faces in the summer, children running around on bikes, neighbors waving as they grilled their dinners. It was small enough that everyone felt like they knew everyone, but big enough that you could keep to yourself if you wanted. In addition to the stationed caravans, there were a handful of open plots where visitors could bring tents or rent a caravan for a few nights. Those temporary spaces were usually filled by couples on holiday or backpackers who wanted to be close to the sea without paying hotel prices. Most of the time, it was peaceful, almost boringly so. The kind of campground where the loudest thing you'd hear after dark was someone laughing too loudly over a card game or the clink of beer bottles. One summer, we went there for a holiday just like always. It felt ordinary from the start. Long walks on the beach, salty wind rattling the plastic windows of the caravan at night, the muffled sound of waves in the distance. We cooked simple meals, read books in lawn chairs, and let the days drift by. We had planned to stay until Sunday, but for some reason we decided to leave on Saturday instead. It wasn't anything dramatic. I don't even remember a strong reason. Maybe the weather was supposed to turn bad. Maybe we just felt like heading home early. Maybe it was one of those gut decisions you don't think much about at the time. We packed up the caravan, locked things down, and drove away that afternoon. That night, while we were already at home, something happened at the campground. I didn't hear about it until the next morning, when the news broke. At first, it didn't register. I saw the photos of the campground, the familiar rows of caravans, the narrow gravel paths, the hedge that ran along the edge of the property. And then I saw it, our caravan, clear as day, printed on the front page of newspapers, splashed across the screen during TV reports. It made my stomach lurch. 2 women had rented a caravan just a few steps away from ours. They were there for a short holiday, nothing unusual. But in the middle of the night, the ex-boyfriend of one of them came to the campground. Nobody saw him enter. He must have slipped in quietly, moving between the rows of caravans while most people were asleep. The whole place hushed under the dark sky and the soft sound of the sea. He went straight to their caravan, and then he attacked them. Both women were stabbed. Somehow, in the chaos and pain, they managed to drag themselves out of the caravan, stumbling into the gravel path, crying out in the night. They collapsed just beside our stationary caravan, in the narrow space between the hedges and the road. That was where they died. I can still picture it when I let myself think too long about it. That little stretch of ground we used to walk across every day to reach the bathrooms. The same patch of gravel where we'd ride our bikes as kids, where we'd sit on fold-out chairs when the sun was low in the evening. That exact spot became a crime scene. The campground that had always felt safe, almost sleepy, was suddenly swarmed with police and reporters. Neighbors who had been there for decades were giving statements, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Strangers who had been camping that night were being questioned, their vacations shattered. And in every photo, there was our caravan in the background, impossible to miss. The newspapers couldn't stop showing it. The TV crews used it as a marker to point out where the women had fallen. It was surreal, like our home away from home had become part of some nightmare story we hadn't chosen. We weren't there, but in a way we were. The thought that haunts me most is the timing. If we had stayed that extra night, we would have been there. We would have heard the sounds in the dark. We might have been the first to see those women stumble out of the caravan, bleeding and terrified, collapsing right in front of us. We might have been the ones to call for help, fumbling with our phones, our hands shaking, our minds not even processing what was happening. Or worse, maybe he wouldn't have stopped with them. Maybe the chaos, the panic, the sight of us rushing out of our caravan would have drawn him closer. Maybe we would have been caught in it. That thought loops through my head every time I let myself imagine it. The thin wall of chance that separated us from witnessing something I'm not sure I could have ever recovered from. In the days after, the story spread everywhere. It was on the front page of every paper. It was in the evening news. Friends and relatives called us, asking if we had been there, if we were safe, if we had seen it happen. Each time I had to repeat the same strange truth. We had been there, we had slept in that caravan, walked those paths, sat in that exact place, and then, for reasons I still can't explain, we left one night early. I kept thinking about the women, two people who had come for the same simple reason as everyone else, to enjoy the sea, the calm, the holiday air. Their lives ended in a place meant for peace. I thought about the silence of the campground, how sound carried easily there. I wondered how many people had woken to faint cries, too distant to recognize, too muffled by canvas walls and tired dreams. I wondered if anyone else had looked out their window and seen shadows moving, not knowing what they were. After that, the campground was never the same for me. We still had the caravan, still went there sometimes, but I couldn't walk past that spot without my chest tightening. Every time I saw our caravan in those old news photos, the memory came rushing back. I would see not just the place where I spent summers, but the place where two women took their last breaths. And always, there was the same thought, pressing at the edges of my mind. If we hadn't left early, we would have been there. We would have seen it all. We would have stood just feet away from death. That night will never really belong to me, but it brushed past me, close enough to leave a mark that hasn't faded, and probably never will. I've always liked being outside more than inside. Even when I was a kid, I would rather be in the woods than sitting in front of the TV. That never really changed as I got older. Hiking, camping, just wandering at night with a flashlight. I did all of it, and I never thought twice about being out after dark. People around me always acted like I was crazy, especially when I'd go out at night, but I never thought it was that big of a deal. The woods are quieter at night, cooler, and the world feels bigger when you can't see much past your light. Still, there's one thing that always sticks in my head. It happened years ago, but whenever I'm out late on some trail and I hear the crack of a branch or the rustle of leaves, I think about it again. It wasn't supernatural. No ghost stories or fairy tale type shit. Just a situation that was real and tense and scary in a way that sticks with you for a long time after. It happened on a camping trip with a couple of friends. We were in this area that had scattered sites off a forest road. Most weren't official campgrounds, just little clearings people used over and over. They were spaced out, but close enough that sometimes if you were walking late, you'd see a fire flickering through the trees from another group. That weekend, we had picked a site way down the road, more isolated than the rest. We set up our tents near the tree line, and the plan was just to hang out, maybe do some night hiking, and head back the next morning. The day went by fine. We ate, talked, walked around the woods a little. By the time it got dark, the others were already ready to sit by the fire and drink. I didn't feel like sitting still, though. I told them I wanted to hike a little before I called it a night. I had my headlamp, a good flashlight, a knife on my belt, and my boots tied tight. I'd done plenty of night hikes before, so it didn't feel like I was doing something stupid. The trail I followed wasn't really a marked trail, just a faint path that wound along the ridge and cut through some heavy brush. The moon wasn't out that night, so the forest was dark. Darker than usual, but with my light it was manageable. I liked that quiet, the way everything else drops away and all you hear are your own footsteps, your own breathing, and the occasional sound of some small animal moving in the distance. About an hour in, I started to notice the smell of smoke. Not the light whiff of someone's fire far away, but heavier, closer. The kind of smoke you get from a campfire that's been burning for hours. A little further ahead, I saw the orange flicker through the trees. Another campsite. Normally, I would have steered clear. I don't like barging into other people's spots, but the trail I was on ran straight through it. The woods on either side were dense and full of brambles. If I wanted to avoid it, I'd have to backtrack or cut through brush so thick it would take half an hour just to move a few yards. I decided to just keep walking. People don't usually care as long as you pass through and don't bother them. As I got closer, the firelight grew, and soon I could see the glow reflecting off the trunks of trees. My boots crunched against gravel and leaves, and I slowed down a little. I didn't want to look like I was sneaking, but I didn't want to storm right through either. My flashlight was still on, so I kept it angled down to the ground so I wouldn't blind anyone. When the campsite came into full view, it looked like any other. Tents set up in a rough circle, a fire in the middle, some folding chairs scattered around. I couldn't see anyone at first, That made me uneasy. The fire was still burning strong, wood stacked high, not like something abandoned. But no voices, no movement, just the fire crackling and popping. I moved slow, looking around as I passed. My light swept across one of the chairs, and I saw a jacket draped over it. A cooler sat half open beside another chair. A couple of empty bottles were knocked over in the dirt. Everything looked lived in, but still no people. I didn't stop, though. I just walked steady and straight through the clearing, heading back toward the line of trees on the far side. Every step I took felt heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, that someone was close, just outside of my light. I kept my focus forward, telling myself it was fine, that people probably just turned in early and went into their tents. But then I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The tents. There were 4 of them, all zipped up, but one had its flap open, just hanging there. I could see inside. The sleeping bags were still rolled up. Nobody was in there. Nobody had slept in there. That struck me as wrong. People don't leave their tents wide open in the woods. Not at night. Bugs, animals, the cold, all reasons to zip it up. My boots crunched louder as I crossed the edge of their firelight and back into the shadows of the trees. I didn't look back. My instincts told me not to. The woods swallowed me again, and the only sound was my own breathing. After about 10 minutes of steady walking, I started to calm down. My headlamp cut a sharp beam through the branches, and I kept my ears tuned for footsteps, voices, anything. Nothing came. It was just me and the forest again. But the silence had a weight to it now, like the air itself was heavier. I stopped once to take a drink of water, and that's when I heard it. A single branch snapping. Not the faint crack of a squirrel, but a solid snap, like someone had stepped on it. Came from behind me back the way I had come. I froze, listening. My light stayed pointed down the trail. The woods stayed quiet. I waited a full minute, standing still, before I started moving again. My pace was quicker this time. My light bounced as I walked, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. That's when I realized the fire glow I'd passed earlier was gone. The trail curved enough that I should have seen the faint orange behind me, but there was nothing. Either the trees were blocking it or it had gone out completely. The rest of the hike back to camp felt like it took hours. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves under my boots, the rush of blood in my ears, the faint breeze moving through the branches overhead. I kept expecting to see another light, another figure, something moving just at the edge of my vision. But it was always just me. When I finally saw the faint flicker of my friend's fire through the trees, I let out a long breath. I didn't realize how tight my chest had been until then. I stepped into the clearing, the sight of the tents and gear exactly where we'd left them. My friends were still up, sitting by the fire, talking low. I didn't say anything about what I'd seen. I just sat down, drank some water, and tried to calm the adrenaline in my veins. That night, lying in my sleeping bag, I thought about that empty campsite, the open tent, the fire burning with no one around it, the snap of that branch behind me. I couldn't explain it, and I still can't. Maybe they'd left in a hurry. Maybe they were off in the woods doing something and just didn't come back while I was passing through. But the way everything felt, the silence, the weight in the air, the wrongness of that open tent, it stuck with me. The next morning, we packed up and left. I didn't go back that way. I didn't want to. I still hike at night sometimes, but I avoid trails that cut through campsites. I'd rather fight through dense bush, scratched arms and all, than walk into a space where I don't belong. Because I keep thinking about that night, about how it must have looked to anyone else, if they were watching me. A stranger walking through their camp in the middle of the night, headlamp glowing, silent, not stopping. If I'd been in their place, half asleep in a tent and caught a glimpse of me moving past the fire, I'd have been terrified. Maybe they had been watching. Maybe they'd been right there, just out of sight. Maybe that snap I heard wasn't them leaving, but following. That's the part that makes my skin crawl the most. I'll never know. When I think back on that weekend, it always starts the same way, with the disappointment of hearing the music festival was canceled. My friend and I had been planning the trip for weeks. The car was already packed, we had our tickets, Food, booze, camping gear, the whole setup ready to go. Then, just as we were about to leave, we got the notification canceled. No rescheduling, no partial event, just a flat cancellation. For a moment, we sat there in the car, staring at each other, all that anticipation hanging in the air with nowhere to go. We could have just unpacked and stayed home, but it felt like such a waste. The weekend stretched out in front of us, all our plans and excitement suddenly collapsing. We didn't want to just throw it all away, so instead we decided to drive. No real plan, no destination in mind, just head out and find somewhere to camp. If we couldn't have the music festival, at least we could still salvage the weekend with some kind of adventure. We headed upstate, winding our way through roads that grew quieter and emptier the farther we went. The houses thinned out, the gas stations became sparse, and eventually, we found ourselves in an area that seemed like it belonged to summer. Little resorts, lakeside cabins, small diners. But it was the end of the season, the last days before everything shut down for the year. The place felt abandoned, drained of the life it must have held only weeks earlier. It had its own kind of beauty, though. The trees were beginning to shift toward autumn colors, the lake surface reflecting a pale gray sky, the air carrying that cool bite of change. It was quiet, almost eerily so, but it was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you've stepped out of time. We found a campground by chance, a faded sign pointing us down a cracked driveway lined with tall grass. The office was a small wooden building with peeling paint, sitting on the edge of a wide clearing dotted with campsites. A single car was parked out front. Inside, there was only one person, the attendant. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with thinning hair and a look that was hard to place. Friendly in a way, but something about him unsettled me. Maybe it was the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, or the way he looked at us a little too long before speaking. The place was empty, he said. End of the season. No one else had checked in, and he doubted anyone else would. That was good enough for us. We wanted privacy anyway. He assigned us a site, scribbling a number onto a slip of paper and sliding it across the counter. When we asked about the layout, he mentioned it was on the far edge, right up against the woods, furthest from everything else. I remember thinking it was odd, almost deliberate, but at the same time, it fit perfectly with what we thought we wanted. No noisy families, no other campers, just isolation. So we drove down. The gravel road curved past row after row of empty campsites, each one with its own picnic table, fire ring, and patch of grass. All of them deserted like a ghost town built for vacations. Our site really was the last one, tucked away at the far end, the forest pressing close on one side, empty plots stretching out on the other. We got out of the car and just stood there for a minute, taking it in. The lake shimmered in the distance, the trees swayed in the breeze, and the silence was total. No voices, no music, no kids screaming, no dogs barking. Just us. We set up camp quickly, laughing about the weirdness of the situation. Tent up, chairs unfolded, cooler unpacked, the little routine of making a temporary home. Once everything was in place, we cracked open beers and let ourselves relax, leaning into the emptiness around us. The day slipped by in a blur of small things, wandering down to the lake, skipping stones, exploring the edges of the campground, returning to sit around a fire we built with damp wood. It felt like we were the last people on Earth. By the time the sun dipped and the air cooled, we were buzzing from drinks, warmed by the fire, and ready to crash. We put out the lantern and crawled into the tent. The fire left smoldering low. The darkness outside was thick, the kind of darkness that makes you aware of every sound. The fabric of the tent felt paper thin, every snap of a twig outside sharp in my ears. That's when we heard it. At first it was faint, almost easy to dismiss. But once you locked onto the sound, it was unmistakable. A long, slow scrape, metal against stone. The rhythm was deliberate, not chopping wood, not an animal rustling, not wind in the trees. Just that steady, metallic stroke, drawn out, almost careful, like someone dragging the edge of a blade along a rock. It was coming from the empty campsites to our left, maybe 100 yards away. I froze, listening. My friend's breathing grew fast and shallow beside me. The sound continued, over and over, Long pauses between strokes, like whoever was doing it had all the time in the world. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. The attendant playing a joke, maybe. He had seemed a little strange. And what better way to freak out a pair of city kids than by making creepy noises in the woods? That thought made me laugh nervously to myself, though the sound caught in my throat. But my friend was terrified. She grabbed her phone and checked the time, then dialed the number from the check-in slip. The faint ring echoed through the dark, and after a moment, she whispered that he was at the office, almost half a mile away, and the scraping continued. There was no way he could have made it back there in time. The realization sank in heavy. The campground was supposed to be empty. We were supposed to be the only ones. Yet out there in the dark, someone was dragging a blade against stone, slow and deliberate, like they wanted us to hear it. We didn't stay in the tent. We couldn't. We grabbed our stuff, keys, a flashlight, the can of bear mace my friend had packed almost as a joke, and scrambled into the car. We locked the doors and sat there, staring into the dark. The sound carried across the empty campground, relentless. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. The hours dragged. My friend eventually fell asleep, slumped against the seat, clutching the mace. But I couldn't close my eyes. I sat there rigid, staring out the windshield, waiting. Every so often I thought I saw something shift in the shadows, but when I blinked it was gone. My mind played tricks, layering shapes into the trees, but the sound never wavered. It only stopped shortly before dawn. One final scrape, then silence. The stillness that followed was worse than the noise itself. My ears rang with it, my body trembling from hours of tension. I waited, straining to hear anything at all. Nothing came, just the wind picking up, the first faint rustle of birds waking. When the sun rose, the world looked harmless again. The campground glowed in soft light, dew glistening on the grass, the lake calm and beautiful. It was hard to believe the night before had even happened. We searched, walked past the empty campsites, checked the fire rings, scanned the ground for footprints. There was nothing. No sign of anyone. No rock with fresh scratches. No mark of metal against stone. The place was empty, just like the attendant had said. We left that morning. We didn't even check out, we just drove away. Even now, I can't explain it. There's no neat answer, no rational way to tie it up. I can only replay the sound in my head. The steady, deliberate rhythm of metal scraping stone, carrying across a deserted campground in the middle of the night. Maybe it was a person who shouldn't have been there. Maybe it was someone who liked the idea of making their presence known without ever revealing themselves. Or maybe it was worse than that. Someone preparing for something we were lucky enough never to see. What stays with me most isn't the sound itself, but the way it stopped. Clean, final, like whoever was making it knew the night was ending, and there was no reason to continue. And when the sun rose, there was no one. Just silence, and the memory of that long, metallic scrape. I've camped a lot in my life, and I've heard plenty of strange noises in the woods. Cracking branches, owls calling, raccoons shuffling around the campsite at night. Most of it you can brush off once you get used to it, even laugh at once you're back home. But there's one night that still comes back to me in flashes, when I can almost smell the cold air again and hear the sound of them circling outside my tent. It was early spring, the kind of season where the days feel mild but the nights still bite with cold. I decided to go on a solo trip, partly for the quiet and partly because I liked pushing myself a little. I packed light, just a small 2-person tent, sleeping bag, pad, a little camp stove, and the usual essentials. I drove out to a forested area I'd been to before, a state park with a mix of hardwood and pine, rolling hills, and streams swollen with snowmelt. When I pulled into the campground, it was almost empty. I think there were maybe 2 other cars in the lot, but I never saw the people who owned them. It was too early in the season for crowds. The trees were still bare, skeletal against the pale sky, their branches rattling in the breeze. The ground was damp with thawing soil, patches of frost still clinging in the shadows. I hiked about a mile in to a site I liked, tucked back against a stand of pines with a small clearing just big enough for my tent. There was a fire ring from past campers, a scattering of logs, and a view through the trees where I could just barely see the shimmer of a stream. It felt private, like I had the whole forest to myself. Setting up camp took no time at all. The tent went up, my sleeping bag unrolled, the little stove set on a flat rock. I spent the afternoon wandering, following deer tracks along the mud by the stream, listening to the rush of water and the calls of woodpeckers echoing through the woods. The air smelled sharp and clean, carrying that faint sweetness of thawing earth and wet pine needles. As the sun dipped lower, I made a small fire, cooked some noodles, and sat back with a mug of tea. The forest changed as the light faded. The chatter of birds quieted, the temperature dropped, and the shadows stretched until the trees were just dark pillars against a dim sky. I let the fire burn down to glowing coals, then doused it and crawled into the tent. The cold crept in quickly, but I was warm enough in my sleeping bag. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or the distant rush of water. It must have been close to midnight when I woke. At first I didn't know why, maybe the cold, maybe some sound in my sleep, but then I heard it. A sharp yip, high and sudden, from the trees. Then another, and then another. Within seconds, it grew into a chorus. A dozen voices, maybe more, yipping, barking, howling, overlapping into a wild cacophony. It was coming from close, too close. My heart hammered as I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. The sound wasn't distant. It wasn't echoing across the hills or rolling up from the valley. It was right there, 40 feet from the tent, maybe less. Coyotes. I'd heard them before, far off, their calls rising like eerie music on the wind. But this was different. This was immediate, surrounding, inescapable. The yips and barks moved in a circle, first from one side of the tent, then the other. I could hear paws scuffing against leaves, the snap of twigs under weight. They weren't staying in one place. They were moving, circling, calling out to each other. I froze. Every instinct told me not to move, not to make a sound. My breath fogged inside the sleeping bag, my hands clammy despite the cold. For 30 minutes, it went on. 30 minutes of wild, frenzied noise, the circle tightening and loosening as they moved around me. Sometimes the calls grew so close I swore I could hear the animals breathing. Other times they drifted back, only to surge forward again in sudden bursts of sound. I pictured them weaving through the trees, lean bodies with glowing eyes, teeth flashing as they barked and yipped. I imagined one of them catching a scent of me inside the thin nylon, nosing closer, curious or hungry. The minutes crawled by. I lost all sense of time, measuring only by the pounding of my heart and the endless rise and fall of the noise. I tried to remember what I knew about coyotes. They rarely attack people. They're usually skittish, more bark than bite. But a pack in the dead of night, stirred up and circling? I couldn't convince myself of the safety in that. Not when I could feel how thin the barrier was between me and them. A layer of nylon, a few flimsy zippers. Nothing that would matter if they wanted to push closer. At some point, I realized my hand was clutching the handle of my pocket knife, the blade still folded, as if that tiny thing would make a difference against a dozen coyotes. The noise was relentless, echoing inside my skull. Every time I thought it might fade, another burst of yips would explode from the dark. My body ached from sitting rigid, my muscles locked with tension. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was brutal. One moment the forest was alive with wild calls, and the next it was empty, hollow, as if nothing had been there at all. My ears rang in the absence of sound. I held my breath, waiting for it to start again, but it didn't. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, staring at the dark outline of the tent walls. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me down, though it was more a series of brief blackouts than real sleep. Every creak of the trees jolted me awake. Every rustle of leaves set my pulse racing. When morning finally came, the light creeping gray through the fabric, I unzipped the tent with shaking hands. The clearing was empty. The ground was damp, scattered with old leaves, nothing out of place. But when I walked to the edge of the woods, I saw them. Tracks, dozens of paw prints in the soft earth, circling the campsite in wide loops. Fresh, sharp-edged, pressed into the mud. They had been everywhere, weaving between the trees, closing in around the tent. I stood there for a long time, staring at the marks. The forest was calm now, birds singing, sunlight filtering through bare branches. It didn't match the memory of the night, the chaos and fear. I packed up quickly, every sound in the trees making me glance over my shoulder. The tracks followed the trail partway out, fading into the brush. By the time I reached the car, I felt like I'd shaken off some heavy weight, though the tension lingered in my chest. Driving away, I kept thinking about it. Coyotes don't usually bother people, I knew that. They must have been riled up about something else, maybe hunting, maybe just calling to each other. But the way they circled the tent, the way the noise pressed in from every side, it didn't feel like background wildlife. It felt like being surrounded, targeted. I don't know what would have happened if I'd unzipped the tent, or made a sound, or stepped outside. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. What I do know is that thin fabric never felt so fragile, and silence never felt so heavy as it did when their yipping finally stopped. That night taught me something I've never forgotten. In the woods, you're never really alone. I grew up hearing bits and pieces of stories from my dad and grandpa about their hunting and fishing trips in the Appalachian Mountains. Most of the time, those stories were calm, simple ones about the peace of nature, or about the thrill of landing a big fish, or about getting lost on a trail for an hour and laughing about it later. But there was one story that always stood out, one that never came out the same way twice, because each time they told it, you could see the weight of the memory on them. Their voices would get quieter, and even though they tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, the way my dad's hands would tighten when he described it told me everything I needed to know. Years later, when I was older, I pieced together all the little details they let slip, and it formed a full picture in my head. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how terrifying it must have been. I've camped plenty of times myself, and I've heard owls, coyotes, foxes, and even bobcats screaming in the night, but nothing they described lined up with those familiar sounds. What happened to them on that river in the Appalachians stayed with them for life, and honestly, just imagining it has stayed with me, too. It was one of those spring nights when the weather shifts back and forth between chilly and warm, when you can see your breath after the sun goes down but still feel damp air clinging to your skin. My dad and grandpa had gone up to the mountains for a fishing trip, something they'd done many times before. The Appalachian rivers can be peaceful but also unpredictable, shallow stretches of rippling current that suddenly give way to deep, dark pools, surrounded by cliffs or thick tree lines. That particular river they chose wasn't popular with tourists. It was tucked away, down an old logging road that barely looked like a road anymore. The kind of place where grass grew right through the ruts and low branches scraped your truck sides as you drove in. They liked it that way. Less noise, fewer people, more fish. By late afternoon, they'd already set up a little camp on the riverbank. They didn't bring much. A couple of rods, tackle boxes, some folding chairs, and enough food and coffee to get through the night. They built a small fire pit out of flat river stones and laid down 2 sleeping bags on tarps just far enough from the flames that stray sparks wouldn't be a problem. They'd planned to fish well into the night, since certain kinds of catfish and bass bite better after dark. My grandpa had always been the tougher one of the two, not in size but in mindset. He had grown up hunting in those woods and knew them well. My dad was bigger, stronger, but he had less of that hard edge. Still, he wasn't someone who scared easily. He'd fought, worked hard labor, spent countless nights in the woods. Nothing really rattled him, but that night managed to. The first hours were ordinary. They sat on the bank with their lines in the water, listening to the fire crackle behind them. The river had that low, steady rush of sound, almost like distant wind. Crickets started up in the grass, frogs croaked from the shallows, and every now and then a fish would break the surface with a splash. My dad told me later that the night sky was crystal clear, so clear that the stars reflected off the river, making it hard to tell where the sky ended and the water began. They both relaxed, drank coffee out of tin mugs, and talked quietly while waiting for bites. It was past midnight when it happened. The forest around them was still alive with normal sounds, until suddenly all of it stopped. The crickets went quiet. The frogs silenced. Even the breeze that had been rustling the leaves seemed to fade. That kind of silence in the woods is never normal. It's like the whole environment holds its breath at the same time, and you can feel the tension settle into your bones even before you understand why. That was when the first scream cut through the night. Came from the opposite side of the river, somewhere back in the woods. My dad described it as one of the most unnatural sounds he had ever heard. It wasn't the scream of a person, though it was close enough to make his chest tighten in recognition. It had that raw, stretched pitch of something human-like, but deeper, rougher, as if something enormous was forcing air through its throat. It rose up sharp and high, then dropped into a low, guttural moan before fading out completely. He froze, rod in hand, staring across the black water. My grandpa didn't move either. They just sat there, waiting. A few seconds later, it came again. Longer this time, more violent. My dad said it made the hairs on his arms stand up instantly, and he could feel goosebumps crawl down his back. Now, he wasn't unfamiliar with the sounds of the mountains. He'd heard bobcats scream, which can sound like a woman shrieking. He'd heard coyotes in packs, their yips and howls blending together into something chaotic. He'd even heard mountain lions from a distance, though they're rare in that region. But nothing he'd ever heard matched this. This was lower, heavier, more deliberate. He said it carried weight, like it wasn't just sound, it was a presence. The worst part was the way it carried across the water. Rivers distort sound, sometimes making things seem closer than they are. Every time the scream echoed, my dad felt like it was aimed at them, like whatever was making that noise knew exactly where they were. The screams kept coming, not in a steady rhythm, but in bursts. Sometimes short, sharp yells that ended almost abruptly. Sometimes long, winding cries that seemed to go on forever. Then silence again, and just when they thought it had stopped, it would start up once more. Minutes stretched into half an hour. My dad told me that during that time he barely breathed. He sat stiff in his chair, his hands locked around the fishing rod he'd forgotten about. His eyes stayed glued to the tree line across the water, even though he could barely make anything out in the dark. He said he felt rooted in place, like moving or even shifting in his chair might draw attention. My grandpa eventually set his rod down and just stared into the woods. Neither of them said anything, not a single word, because it was as if speaking would somehow break the thin barrier of safety they had by staying still. There was another detail my dad never shook off. Every so often, between the screams, there would be rustling in the brush. Not a deer moving quietly, not the light scurry of raccoons or foxes, but something heavier, something breaking branches, pressing through thick undergrowth without care. Each time it happened, the screams would follow, as if the sound and the movement belonged to the same thing. He said that at one point, he could swear he saw a shadow shift in the trees when the moonlight caught the clearing on the opposite bank, but he forced himself to look away. He couldn't bear to confirm it. When the screaming finally stopped, the silence felt worse than the noise. The crickets and frogs never came back. The only sound left was the river, and even that seemed muted somehow. They didn't sleep that night. They sat by the dying fire, staring into the darkness until the faint glow of morning light started to creep over the horizon. When they finally packed up and left, neither of them said a word on the way home. They didn't have to. Both of them knew what they had heard, and both of them knew it wasn't normal. After that, they never fished that stretch of the river at night again. They'd go during the day sometimes, but once the sun dropped, they made sure to be gone. The mountains have plenty of mysteries, and plenty of sounds you can learn to explain. But what they heard that night was something different, something that didn't fit any category. My dad told me years later that he can still hear it, even now, if he closes his eyes and lets his mind wander back. The sound is burned into him, the way certain traumatic noises stick with you forever. He said sometimes he'll be sitting in silence at night and he'll think about how, for 30 minutes straight, whatever was across that river screamed its anger into the dark, and how every second of it, he felt like it knew he was listening. That's why, when people tell stories about the woods, about how eerie or unsettling they can be, I always think back to that one. Because I know my dad, and I know my grandpa, and I know they weren't the type to spook easily. If that night could freeze them in fear, then whatever was out there was nothing either of them ever wanted to meet face to face. And I think about how, if they had been on the other side of the river instead of their own bank, they might not have had that thin line of water between them and the thing that screamed. They never went back at night, and I never will either.